that one of the dangers that we've kind of learned so far is that we don't just replicate what was available to women. So we've learned culturally it's not appropriate to just replicate, say, this is for this cultural group and provide the exact same service. And I think similarly, the experiences of men's refuges, particularly in Britain, has shown that that's not necessarily the type of response that is most helpful for men who are victimised as a result of intimate violence. And so I think we need to be careful about not just replicating and saying, if women victims need this, men victims need that, that's not a sort of helpful strategy, but to acknowledge the kind of, I think all victims have experienced a level of private shame in disclosing what's happened to them, and we need to understand men's shame around coming forward about that and provide the kind of respectful support services that we've offered to men who've been victims of child sexual abuse. So I think that in that sense, the kind of skills amongst workers are relatively similar that are required to, you know, acknowledge men to come forward, and we look possibly at some of the kind of things that happen to workers in first hearing about those stories from men might be a useful way to do it.
What have been some of the barriers? I mean, it appears to me that we're talking about notions of masculinity that prevents men from coming forward, or those notions of private shame about I couldn't acknowledge that that's what was happening. Because I didn't want to be seen as wimpish or weak or what have you. Comments from the panellists. I mean, there might be gay men, I think, who experience a whole range of barriers that mean that they won't come forward.
I think there's four. I think there's four barriers. The first is around myths of domestic violence that are prevalent amongst gay men. So, for example, that domestic violence only happens to women. And that's a really, really strong myth within the gay male community. And one of the issues with that in moving forward is that men don't necessarily identify the abuse that they're experiencing as being domestic violence, because it's something that only happens to women. I think the second thing is we can't, just as we can't divorce patriarchy from domestic violence, we can't divorce heterosexism and gay male domestic violence. And so manipulating the myths and manipulating homophobia as a tactic of the abuse is really common, and that serves as a significant barrier. And one of the things I hear about often is gay men will describe quite horrific sexual abuse, but will not identify it as being sexual abuse because there's certain myths and perceptions and stereotypes around gay male sexuality. So that all gay men like rough sex, or all gay men like anal sex. And so a lot of the gay male victims, when you talk with them, will go, do you know, I never actually thought that that was abuse that I was experiencing. I think the third thing that relates to the expression of heterosexism is secondary victimisation. So when gay men do actually seek help, then they experience discrimination, they experience homophobia in the context of their help-seeking behaviour. And so many gay men will talk about the reason why they won't seek help from the police, from general practitioners, from medical services, is because in the past they've actually been discriminated against in that provision of service. Or they know somebody who has, or there's the perception and the expectation that it will happen. So they self-select out of not seeking help in the first place. And I think the final thing is that as service providers, we don't ask the question. So we don't actually ask men who might be presenting with injuries or with experiences that could be consistent with domestic violence. We don't actually say, hey buddy, could you be experiencing relationship abuse? I have a referral from yesterday from a guy who has told me that he's had contact with the health system over 30 times for a whole range of injuries. No one has, up to this point, said to him, is your partner doing this? Are you afraid of your partner? So I think the final thing is we have to ask the question.
I tend to think that you need different skills for working with men than working with women. And I think that's one of the problems of men not coming to counselling services, because they can't deal with the way that they're supposed to relate in a counselling session. oftentimes men are experienced in a counselling session as being defensive or resistant or that kind of thing, when they're not really. It's just they don't have the language, they don't have the understanding and the insight. They know they've got a problem and they want to do something about it. But oftentimes the counselling process is one that doesn't work for them. So I think that what I've learned over the years is number one, it's important to be quite direct with guys. Just talk to them very bluntly. They don't like me just sort of going around and being really subtle. They want it to be very, very clear and very straight and get to the point. They also, I need to believe them when they say they don't know. Oftentimes they really, really mean it, and to start to give them language by talking about other guys' experience. You know, other guys say that this is what goes on for them. Can you relate to that? And that helps them to feel more normal, because guys are particularly isolated and alone within their own inner world. So it's and I think the other thing that really helps to engage men is to help give them an idea that I have a positive regard for them, because most of them are expecting me to think they're no good and not to believe them. It's important to believe them and keep listening and unpacking, and so that if they really are a victim of DV, that I will really get to that, and I'll believe it. I will tell them straight up that I'm sceptical, but it's important to keep listening and keep getting them to talk, because it may well be that's the case. And if they're expecting me not to believe, then they're not going to talk at all. So it's important to listen. And I think the final point is that they need, a lot of the guys are wanting to know that they're not all bad. They're prepared to look at the things they do wrong, as long as they are not being put in the position of being all bad, which means that it's important to acknowledge some of the errors and the mistakes in their partner, and for them not just to be, the whole thing is your problem. I found that once a guy's able to hear from me that, yep, she's got her problems as well, and I acknowledge that and I recognise that, let's name it, then after that he's more prepared to look at himself, which is what the whole purpose of the exercise is. But he needs to have that acknowledgement before he can do that. So the skills are very, very special in working with men. I think that's one of the important